You begin to notice something important once enough of these voices have passed through you. They do not actually sit beside one another as separate teachings for very long. At first they do, because the mind needs categories in order to receive anything at all. One voice appears to teach exploration, another remembrance, another structure, another stillness, another sovereignty, another informational reality. But if you stay with them long enough, the categories start losing their edges, and what remains is not a shelf of teachings, but a single field speaking through different human arrangements. That matters, because most people are trained to approach teachers as if each one owns a territory. One owns the soul, one owns the mind, one owns consciousness, one owns awakening, one owns social truth, one owns metaphysical architecture. But reality does not divide itself that neatly. The mind divides it because separation is easier to manage than wholeness. The deeper you go, the more you begin to see that each true teacher is touching the same living structure from a different point of entry. That is the first thing this convergence reveals. What changes from teacher to teacher is usually not the truth itself, but the angle of pressure through which the truth becomes visible. One teacher speaks to the part of you that needs courage. Another speaks to the part that needs stillness. Another reaches the part that cannot trust what it cannot map. Another reaches the part that cannot awaken until it remembers it was never as small as it was told. The field adjusts its language because human entry points are different, but the field itself remains one. Once you see that, comparison begins to lose its appeal. The question stops being which teacher is right and starts becoming what function each one performs in the larger ecology of awakening. This is a more mature way of listening, because it frees you from the need to rank voices by preference. A teacher can be necessary without being complete. A teacher can be true within their function without having to contain the whole of reality. The unified field does not require sameness. It requires recognizable coherence across difference. That coherence is easier to feel when you stop listening only for conclusions and start listening for movement. What does a teacher move in the listener? What inner mechanism becomes activated when they speak? Do they loosen fear? Do they increase dignity? Do they sharpen discernment? Do they return you to presence? Do they restore structure where life felt fragmented? Do they make it harder for you to lie to yourself? These are not small effects. They are signs that the teaching is participating in a deeper current than personality. This is why the lineage goes beyond names. A name tells you where a transmission passed through history. It does not tell you the size of the field behind it. Names are useful because human beings need form. We need faces, books, voices, eras, and stories in order to orient ourselves. But names also become limitations the moment we mistake them for ownership. The teacher does not create the field. The teacher becomes permeable enough for the field to move through them in a way others can receive. That shift in perspective changes how you understand influence itself. Influence is not merely admiration or imitation. In its deeper form, influence is resonance recognition. Something in you hears a tone in another voice and realizes that your own life has been quietly waiting for that frequency. This is why some teachings feel immediate even when their language is strange, and why other teachings remain conceptually clear but spiritually distant. The unified field does not move through agreement first. It often moves through recognition before understanding catches up. You may have already noticed this in your own experience with this series. One teacher likely entered you through the mind, another through memory, another through tension, another through relief. Some may have challenged you more than comforted you. Others may have clarified something you had felt for years but never named. That variation is not a problem to solve. It is evidence that awakening is not one motion repeated identically. It is a field meeting different structures in different ways until enough coherence gathers for a deeper synthesis to begin. And that synthesis is not something you force. It begins naturally once the listener stops treating teachings as competing systems and starts sensing them as complementary pressures. Robert Monroe opens the possibility that consciousness is not trapped in the body. Dolores Cannon returns the memory that healing and remembering belong together. Michael Newton reveals that continuity exists between lives and choices. David Hawkins shows that consciousness carries measurable consequence. Ashayana Dean restores the intuition that reality has architecture. David Icke pushes perception away from passive obedience. Eckhart Tolle clears a place inside the noise where awareness can actually hear. Jim Elvidge suggests that reality may be informational at its root. Malcolm X insists that no awakening is real if the self remains authored by someone else. Once these are felt together, the field behind them begins to reveal itself. That field is not built from agreement on every point. It is built from convergence around deeper patterns. Again and again, the listener is brought back to a few living recognitions. Consciousness is more fundamental than it first appears. Identity is less fixed than it first appears. Reality responds to alignment more than the conditioned mind expects. Structures matter, but so does the quality of the being moving through them. Freedom is not merely external, and spirituality is not merely private. When these recognitions keep returning across very different voices, repetition stops feeling redundant and starts feeling diagnostic. It tells you that you are not listening to isolated brilliance. You are listening to a field with recurring laws. From there, another implication begins unfolding. If these teachings are expressions of one field, then the listener also belongs to that field. You are not standing outside it as a consumer of insight. You are inside the same living structure the teachers are describing, translating, and embodying. This matters because it removes passive distance. It becomes harder to ask only what they taught and easier to ask what in you is being activated, resisted, strengthened, or exposed by their presence. The field is not only informational, it is participatory. That participation changes the meaning of lineage itself. Most people hear lineage and imagine inheritance through formal succession, approval, or membership. But there is another kind of lineage that forms through awakened function rather than institutional belonging. You enter it not by claiming status, but by becoming permeable to the same truth current in your own way. This is humbling because it removes the fantasy of borrowed authority. It also liberates you because it means you do not have to sound like any teacher in order to stand in the same field they stood in. You have to become honest enough, clear enough, and aligned enough that the current can move through your own structure without distortion. There is also a caution hidden inside this understanding. The moment the listener starts filling the field behind the names, the mind often tries to possess it quickly. It wants to summarize, conclude, and declare mastery. But the unified field resists premature closure because it is larger than any neat synthesis. It can be described but not exhausted. It can be entered but not owned. And this is good because the moment a living field becomes a slogan, it stops teaching and starts being used as identity furniture. So, this convergence episode does not exist to flatten the difference between these voices. It exists to make their deeper relationship visible without reducing their uniqueness. The field is one, but its expressions remain distinct for a reason. A world made only of stillness would fail to confront power. A world made only of fire would burn without integrating. A world made only of structure would lose tenderness. A world made only of memory would drift without embodiment. The unified field holds them together because wholeness requires multiple functions moving in resonance rather than one function trying to become everything. Once that begins to settle, you may notice a gentler but more demanding realization arriving underneath it all. The lineage beyond names is not asking whether you agree with these teachers. It is asking whether you can recognize the field that has been trying to reach you through them. It is asking whether you can feel the common movement beneath the different vocabularies. It is asking whether you are willing to stop collecting voices long enough to let one living current begin organizing your own perception from within. And if that current is already beginning to gather, then the next step is not to rush toward closure. It is to stay near the place where these voices stop sounding separate, because that is usually where the field begins teaching you directly, not in defiance of them, but through the deeper continuity they were each pointing toward in their own necessary way. Once you begin to sense that field directly, another change happens that is easy to miss at first. You stop listening to these voices only for information and start listening for pattern. Information fills the mind. Pattern reorganizes perception. That difference matters, because information can be collected without changing the person who collects it, while pattern begins altering the way reality is interpreted before the mind has fully summarized why. This is where the unified field stops being a concept about teachers and starts becoming an active force inside the listener. You may notice this in a very ordinary way. A sentence from one teacher returns while you are reading another. A pattern of thought you once treated as separate now begins appearing as part of the same architecture. A question that once felt philosophical begins showing up in the body, in relationships, in work, in the timing of decisions, and what now feels tolerable and what suddenly does not. This is one of the mechanisms of convergence. The field does not only join ideas together, it reveals that your life has already been the place where those ideas were waiting to meet. That is why the unified field cannot be reduced to agreement across doctrines. Doctrines are mental arrangements. The field is functional. It reveals itself by what it starts changing in you once it is recognized. The signs are subtle at first. You become less impressed by spiritual performance and more attentive to actual coherence. You become less concerned with who sounds advanced and more concerned with what kind of truth a voice produces in the listener. You begin to sense that some teachings enlarge language while others enlarge being, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This changes how you understand credibility. In the ordinary mind, credibility is often assigned through external forms, credentials, systems, tradition, popularity, or technical fluency. But in a unified field, credibility begins to operate through consequence. What happens in a person after contact with a teaching? Are they more honest, more grounded, more capable of holding paradox without panic, more able to discern between sensation and signal, more willing to face what they were previously decorating with abstraction? These become stronger indicators than polish, because the field is measured not only by what it says, but by what it makes possible. That same shift also reorders the meaning of contradiction. At the beginning of a lineage journey, contradiction feels like a problem. One teacher emphasizes stillness, another demands confrontation. One returns you to inward awareness, another turns you towards structural reality. One deepens surrender, another strengthens authorship. If you remain only at the level of statement, these can appear incompatible. But the field begins to clarify once you see that each emphasis is often corrective. A teaching does not always tell you what is universally primary. It often tells you what is missing in the listener it is trying to reach. This is why convergence does not produce sameness. It produces proportion. The unified field is not asking every teaching to say the same thing with different vocabulary. It is showing how different pressures restore wholeness when applied to different distortions. Stillness is not meant to erase sovereignty. Sovereignty is not meant to erase receptivity. Structural understanding is not meant to replace direct presence. Presence is not meant to deny consequence. The field becomes more coherent as you stop forcing one medicine to act like the whole body. When that lands, a deeper kind of respect begins to form. You stop needing every teacher to reassure you in the same tone. Some voices are tender because the listener is fractured. Some are severe because the listener is asleep. Some are precise because the listener is lost in vagueness. Some are spacious because the listener is trapped in tension. The field is not random in the way it distributes emphasis. It meets human imbalance with the pressure most capable of restoring movement. Once you see that, even the teachers who felt least like your preference can begin to reveal a function you had been too identified to recognize. This recognition has an experiential effect. It makes the listener less reactive and more discerning. Reaction asks, "Do I like this voice?" Discernment asks, "What does this voice do, and why does that matter here?" That is a significant maturation. It moves the relationship to teaching away from taste and toward function. It also makes projection easier to detect because you begin noticing that what most irritates or captivates you in a teacher often reveals more about the part of you being touched than about the teacher themselves. The unified field also begins to expose a hidden assumption many seekers carry for years without noticing. They assume awakening is mainly about finding the right teacher, the right language, the right synthesis, the right final frame. But once enough convergence voices begin working inside a person, the question shifts. It becomes less about finding the right external voice and more about becoming internally ordered enough to receive what has already been spoken around you for years. The field has always been present. What changes is the listener's capacity to hear a relationship where they once heard fragments. This is where the teaching becomes quietly demanding. Because once the field is sensed, you can no longer hide as easily behind selective listening. You can no longer keep taking only the comforting teachers and ignoring the ones who expose your blind spots. You cannot keep admiring structural insight while refusing behavioral consequence. You cannot keep speaking about freedom while remaining dependent on borrowed perception. The unified field has a way of tightening the relationship between insight and embodiment. It does not become harsher, it becomes harder to compartmentalize. At the same time, it becomes more generous, because once the field is recognized, you stop expecting one teacher to carry all your unfinished work. That expectation is one of the reasons people burn out on teachings they once loved. They ask a single voice to become total nourishment, correction, translation, and confirmation for every stage of their becoming. But the field is wider than that. It distributes nourishment across multiple functions. And when the listener begins honoring that, their relationship to the lineage becomes less possessive and more alive. They can receive more deeply without needing to reduce the source to a personal brand of certainty. This also changes what memory means inside a lineage. Memory is no longer only recall of teachings or favorite phrases. It becomes pattern retention. You begin to carry not just what a teacher said, but how a certain truth tends to return through different doors. You remember the feel of a deeper law when it appears again, even if the vocabulary is new. This is one of the signs that the field is starting to organize perception. Recognition begins happening faster than analysis. The listener does not become less thoughtful, they become more internally coherent before thought catches up. And from there, the implication widens again. If a field can organize perception through different teachers, then the lineage is not only historical, it is active. It is not merely a collection of voices from different eras. It is a living arrangement of functions that can continue working whenever a listener becomes resonant enough to participate in that arrangement consciously. This is why certain sequences matter, not because order is sacred in itself, but because ordered exposure can strengthen the very capacities needed to receive the next voice more fully. One teaching opens the door, another one can finally walk through. That means this convergence is not the end of the playlist logic. It is the beginning of a different kind of listening. You start to realize that the field does not only move from teacher to listener, it also moves between teachers inside the listener, creating new constellations of meaning that no single episode could fully generate on its own. One phrase stabilizes another, one contradiction reveals a missing layer in a previous understanding. One voice gives language to attention another voice awakened but did not name. In that sense, the field teaches through relation as much as through individual transmission. This is why the lineage beyond names has to remain beyond names, even while still honoring them. The names matter because they mark the human courage through which these frequencies entered history. They matter because gratitude needs form. But if the listener stops at form, the deeper continuity remains inaccessible. And if the listener bypasses form too quickly, the humanity of transmission is lost. The field asks for a more mature balance than either idolization or flattening. It asks you to honor the vessel without mistaking it for the totality of what moved through it. When that balance begins to settle, something surprisingly simple becomes visible underneath all the complexity. The field is teaching you how to live in relationship to truth without turning truth into possession. That is what these voices model in very different ways. Some reach it through courage, some through stillness, some through memory, some through structure, some through consequence, some through perception. But the underlying motion remains recognizable. Truth is not there to decorate identity, it's there to reorganize it. And perhaps that is why the unified field can never fully resolve into a neat summary. The moment it becomes too neatly summarized, it stops functioning as a field and becomes another conclusion the mind can carry without being changed by it. So the teaching must remain slightly larger than the phrase that tries to contain it. It must remain more alive than the explanation offered about it. And once you begin to feel that directly, you may notice that what you are listening for now is no longer just what each teacher meant, but what kind of listener the field is slowly asking you to become. Once that question becomes real, the entire purpose of the lineage shifts. It is no longer only a record of who awakened you. It becomes a mirror for how awakening actually happens. Not as a single event, not as one revelation that solves every layer of distortion, but as a gradual reordering of the listener through repeated contact with truth in different forms. The field does not merely inform you, it teaches you how to become teachable. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Many people want spiritual understanding without becoming internally rearrangeable. They want truth that confirms them, refines their language, or stabilizes their identity. The unified field does something more intimate. It makes certain inner positions increasingly difficult to maintain. Old forms of certainty begin feeling thinner. Defensive ways of interpreting experience lose some of their old authority. You do not abandon them all at once, but you begin to notice how much effort it takes to keep pretending they still fit. This is one of the deeper mechanisms of lineage beyond names. It does not force change. It changes what you can comfortably remain inside. A person can still choose old distortions, old habits, old loyalties, but they begin doing so with more awareness of cost. And once cost becomes visible, repetition is no longer innocent. It may continue for a time, sometimes for a long time, but it is now accompanied by a quieter knowing that the pattern has already been outgrown. That knowing is not punishment. It is an early form of liberation. You can see this in the different teachers you have been moving with. Some do not so much give new information as make old compromise harder to tolerate. Malcolm X makes managed identity harder to tolerate. Eckhart Tolle makes compulsive mind knows harder to tolerate. David Icke makes passive consumption of approved narratives harder to tolerate. Hawkins makes low-grade internal incoherence harder to tolerate. Monroe, Cannon, and Newton make the idea of consciousness as merely physical harder to tolerate. Asha Nadine makes vague spirituality without structure harder to tolerate. Jim Elvidge makes an accidental universe feel less and less sufficient as an explanation. This is how a field works when it begins affecting a life. It does not always announce itself through peak experiences. Sometimes it moves by narrowing the set of illusions you can live inside without friction. At first, the listener thinks they are only collecting teachings. Later, they realize they are being made more available to consequence. This can feel inconvenient before it feels sacred, because it increases responsibility faster than it increases comfort. But that, too, is part of the maturation process. A deeper kind of listening forms here. You no longer come to a teaching only to ask what it says. You begin asking what kind of inner movement it requires in order to be heard correctly. Some teachings can only be heard once pride weakens. Others can only be heard once fear quiets. Others require enough structural clarity that they are not mistaken for fantasy. Others require enough softness that they are not misread as attack. The unified field teaches the listener that hearing is not passive. It is participatory, conditional, and developmental. This explains why certain teachers arrive into your life at different times with very different force. A voice that once felt irrelevant can later become essential, not because it changed, but because the listening structure in you changed. The field had always been present. Your capacity to receive it had not yet reached that threshold. This is why genuine lineage should create humility rather than superiority. It reminds you that timing is not only about exposure, it is about preparedness, ripeness, and the gradual building of internal room. That internal room is one of the least discussed aspects of spiritual development. People speak often about awakening, far less about capacity. Yet capacity determines what can actually be held without distortion. A person can encounter profound truth and still convert it into identity performance, premature certainty, or decorative language if the structure to hold it is not yet there. The unified field becomes protective here because multiple voices balancing one another reduce the chance that one insight will become tyrannical. One teacher opens, another grounds, another sharpens, another softens, another demands embodiment, another refuses abstraction. Together they build holding capacity that a single stream might not sustain by itself. This is where the field becomes less like a playlist and more like a nervous system. Each voice begins functioning like a different channel of regulation, awareness, or correction. One helps orient, one helps interrupt old programming, one helps restore stillness, one helps map complexity, one helps recover dignity, one helps restore consequence, one helps widen reality beyond material assumption, one helps return the listener to a deeper sense that all of this is not separate activity, but one organism of teaching. Once seen this way, the lineage is no longer a set of influences. It becomes an integrated ecology. And as with any ecology, imbalance becomes easier to see. A person can become overdeveloped in one stream and underdeveloped in another. They may become structurally sophisticated, but emotionally defended. They may become deeply still, but socially evasive. They may become fiercely sovereign, but resistant to surrender. They may become psychologically aware, but metaphysically narrow. They may become cosmically expansive, but behaviorally ungrounded. The unified field helps correct these imbalances, not through shame, but through relationship. It brings the missing functions back into view until the listener can no longer confuse partial development with wholeness. This is also why the field beyond names should not be romanticized into abstraction. It is not a sentimental idea that all teachers are secretly the same. They are not. They differ in depth, in precision, in distortion, in scope, in temperament, and in consequence. The field does not erase that. It makes those differences meaningful by placing them within a larger living pattern. This is more demanding than flattening everything into unity, because it asks the listener to hold both distinction and convergence at once. Mature perception does not choose between them. It learns how one reveals the other. You may notice something else as this matures. Gratitude begins changing shape. At first, gratitude is directed toward the teacher as a person, which is natural and often necessary. But later, gratitude becomes more spacious. It includes the courage of the person, the timing of your encounter, the way the teaching entered your life, the conditions that made you available to it, and the larger field that kept arranging meaningful contact through different voices over time. Gratitude becomes less possessive and more reverent. It stops clinging to the vessel and starts recognizing the continuity of what moved through it. That recognition has consequences for how you live after the teaching. If you truly understand the lineage beyond names, then the task is not merely to keep consuming voices. The task becomes learning how to participate in the same field without imitation. This is where many seekers become uncertain, because borrowed clarity can feel safer than lived clarity. Borrowed language allows a person to sound awake before they have embodied what they are repeating. But the field is not ultimately interested in how well you can repeat what awakened you. It is interested in whether your own life can begin transmitting the same depth of coherence in your own language, your own choices, your own way of meeting reality. That does not mean becoming a teacher in the public sense. It means becoming less divided in the private sense, less split between what you know and what you enact, less dependent on outer reinforcement for inner truth, less interested in collecting high language and more willing to allow the field to simplify you where simplicity is honest. The lineage beyond names does not ask every listener to become a speaker. It asks every listener to become less false. And this may be the deepest way the unified field reveals itself. It does not leave the listener untouched. If it is real, it must eventually begin shaping not just perception, but conduct. Not just language, but attention. Not just what you admire, but what you can no longer justify. This is where the field stops being inspiring and becomes formative. It begins to influence what you say yes to, what you stop excusing, what kinds of conversations you can still endure, what kinds of compromises now feel corrosive. Without dramatics, without declarations, your life begins rearranging around a different internal gravity. Then another implication opens quietly. If the field can work through names without being confined to them, then it can continue moving through lives that are not yet recognized as part of the lineage. The teachers you know become evidence of a larger principle. not the final list of those through whom it may move. This prevents the lineage from becoming closed or nostalgic. It remains open to future expression without losing reverence for what has already come through. A living field must remain capable of fresh articulation, or it becomes a museum. That openness is not an invitation to spiritual consumerism. It is an invitation to better listening. Not every voice belongs to the same current. Not every intense personality is transmitting depth. Not every articulate mind is rooted in the field. But once you have spent enough time with the real lineage, you begin to detect its signature more quickly. There is a recognizable quality to teachings that leave the listener more coherent, more honest, more spacious, more responsible, and more alive to consequence. There is also a recognizable quality to teachings that merely stimulate, decorate, or inflate. The unified field sharpens that discernment over time. And perhaps that is the point at which the convergence becomes most intimate. You stop asking only whether these teachers belong together and begin asking what in you has now become capable of belonging to the same stream of truthfulness, not because you have reached some final place, but because the field has slowly trained your perception, deepened your honesty, and widened your sense of what teaching is for. It was never only there to fascinate you, it was there to make you more real, more permeable to what matters, and more able to recognize the same living current whenever it begins speaking again through another voice, another life, or another threshold you have not yet crossed.